Good morning, good evening, everybody. Time zone inclusive welcome to the 11th event in the Amsterdam Center for European Studies Decolonizing Europe seminar series. I'm Polly Pallister-Wilkins, a faculty member of the Department of Politics here at the University of Amsterdam. And I'm very pleased to say that for this session on decolonizing humanitarianism, we are joined by two important critical academic voices and public intellectuals, Dr. Farhana Sultana from Syracuse University in the US and Dr. Tobias Denskus from Malmö University in Sweden to discuss decolonizing humanitarianism and aid more broadly. Now, Dr. Farhana Sultana is an interdisciplinary geographer whose work spans topics such as political ecology, water governance, climate change, post-colonial development, sustainability, social and environmental justice, transnational feminism, and decolonizing academia. Alongside this, she has worked for the United Nations Development Programme in Bangladesh and a number of NGOs. As well as being an important public voice on decolonial feminism and issues of climate justice, she is the author of a number of books on water politics and the right to water, as well as a number of articles concerned with recalibrating knowledge production, meanings of justice, decolonizing feminisms, and political ecologies. She is joined today by Dr. Tobias Denskus, an anthropologist or aidnographer working on the transnational politics of aid communities or aidland. His research is interdisciplinary, combining anthropology, development studies, and communication, focusing on aid as an epistemic community, representation and the role of performance, as well as social entrepreneurship, DIY aid, the politics of open aid approaches, and volunteerism. As a number of his publications show, he has a particular interest in how aid work is communicated, and as part of that runs the Aidnography blog that provides an accessible platform for critical developments in aidland, including recent discussions spurned by the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movements. So welcome to you both. It is fantastic to have you joining us virtually today. And before we start our discussion, I would just like to remind the audience that they can ask questions using the Q&A feature. So getting to the substantive part of our discussion now, what has been so interesting for me as I revisited your work in preparation for this discussion today, and have therefore been reading you alongside each other, is that although you both focus your attention on different aspects of the aid world, critical fault lines concerned with the politics of aid and by extension decolonization run through your work, whether it is on the sustainable development goals, political ecologies, aidland as an epistemic community, or the capacity for TED Talks to facilitate change. And one of these themes is representation. Who is represented? What is represented? Why is it represented? And how is it represented? Could I ask you to reflect on representation in decolonizing humanitarian aid or the aid world more broadly? And maybe Farhana, you would like to go first here.
Sure. Thank you so much, Polly, for the generous introduction and for the invitation to join today and for this question. And thank you to everyone who's joining us from around the world. So I think the issue of representation is really critically important in humanitarianism and in international development and aid, or any intervention for that matter, be it climate adaptation, water governance, environmental management, and so on. So the issues that you identified, the what, the who, the why, the how, have been occurring for a few decades already, and there have been greater calls for accountability and transparency. So alongside this, what we're seeing is a call for decolonization, because the question has arisen about whose voice is being heard or heeded or taken into account, but also which groups of marginalized people have influence over decision-making powers, and then to what end. So we know that some scholars have argued that humanitarianism and development shares a problem of Orientalism and othering, and that there are racialized hierarchies that are ever present in the way humanitarian aid or development aid is discursively produced, but then also practiced on the ground. So if we want to think about how they've been approached, historically, they've often been depoliticized. They're seen as inherently good and thereby unquestionable. But we know that that simply isn't the case, right? There have been interrogations and reflections of how framing occurs, what kind of representations are taking place, and then how those framings and those discussions therefore impact the lived experiences of people and ecosystems, impacts on ecosystems. So what we're seeing is this persistent problem of marginalization of different groups of people about their voices and ideas and worldviews often being sidelined. So therefore, for me, this brings into the question who the expert is, and I use expert in quotation marks. So where does valid knowledge really come from? Because it is often assumed that the expert of humanitarianism or development or so on is often from the West or the global North, that it is somebody who has already arrived at some form of great expertise and knowledge, and therefore people of the global South or marginalized communities, who are often racialized communities, therefore know less. They're not experts. So what we're seeing is this ongoing centering and universalization of Western knowledge as the only form of knowledge. And this has resulted in what is often called epistemicide and ongoing forms of domination. So I think it's really important to consider how representation occurs in both knowledge production. Where does it come from? What assumptions does it rely on? And then what does deconstructing its facade really reveal? So we can turn to ideas about who is speaking for whom, what are they saying, why are they saying it, and why at this time? So what we're seeing is this ongoing issue of narratives, imagery, and power structures and discourses that are often colonial in their underlying ideologies and assumptions. So scholars have called this the ongoing coloniality, that is recreating or reproducing certain colonial relations of domination, oppression, exploitation, and certainly representation, even if we can say there are independent nation states. So one way that people are increasingly querying these issues is thinking about the imagery of the Western savior or the white savior, because there's always this sense of saving the other, the brown and black peoples from themselves, from each other, to civilize them, to help them, to improve them, and so on. So as a result, we're seeing all kinds of interventions and policies and projects being formulated that are often problematic, because people who are marginalized are often at the table in a very tokenistic capacity, if they are at all. For instance, the very discourses of participatory development or community humanitarianism have been critiqued for romanticizing the community, homogenizing communities, or fetishizing what participation is. So to counter the problem of the expert and the saviors and these colonial forms of representation, we're seeing a shift to other issues that don't always account for intersectional differences, contextual axes of oppression, or scalar power dynamics or geopolitics. And I think it's really important to understand that these intersectionalities across gender, race, class, ethnicity, and so on are situated within wider historical tapestries of colonialism, of ongoing geopolitics and globalization. And so therefore we really need to understand, like, where's the visibility, what is being hyper-visibilized, but then also what is invisibilized in the process in trying to fix certain ongoing problems. So I think my final thoughts would be that when we think about representation, we really need to think about the underlying conceptualizations and epistemologies. Are they really being driven by certain ethos of anti-racism, anti-colonialism, anti-patriarchy, or anti-fascism? So are they really taking into account Southern or indigenous cosmologies or pluralizing voices? Are we thinking about ethical intersectional practices? So we need to think about both the objects and subjects of interventions and think about where power is exercised, how people and ideas are being represented, and the embodied practices of those who are actually carrying out the work.
Fantastic. Can I throw it open to you now, Tobias?
Well, thanks, Farhana and Polly. I have a feeling there's not much left for me to say, actually. That was such an excellent introduction, very powerful. But I think actually I wanted to maybe sort of reiterate a little bit of what Farhana said. I read this really nice tweet the other day by Timothy Gross, who's a professor for China studies. And he tweeted, colonization is not just about erasing and redefining territories and culture, it's about disciplining individual bodies. And I found this very powerful because for me, the discussion we are having right now around decolonization of aid or humanitarianism, it's also a reminder that it's about the literal decolonization, but that it obviously follows on a long trajectory, as Farhana already pointed out, the existing power imbalances, the lack of diversity or the existing inequalities, race, class, and so on. So I think when we use a word like decolonization, we should keep in mind that it follows on that longer trajectory of how can we make other voices count, make other knowledge come to the fore. And I think especially for me, and this is sort of where my own positionality as a sort of white European man comes in, is that I also feel that, when I'm based in Sweden and I often hear in Nordic countries that, decolonization is less of an issue because, most Nordic countries didn't have colonies. So of course, in that kind of, literal definition, we leave the Danish out because they had colonies and they still, have their ongoing issues with Greenland. But obviously, this is also the mindset, when we, for example, talk about the indigenous communities in northern Sweden. So that is as much part when we talk about humanitarianism, how do we engage with different groups? So that's as much an issue at home as it is abroad. And I think, of course, Farhana pointed out, white saviorism and sort of the global northern and southern debates. But I think it's really important to keep in mind that when we talk about decolonization, the way we understand it, is also something that happens at home in our organization with our own local communities and indigenous communities. But I also wanted, so before we kind of go down the route of completely dismantling humanitarianism, I also wanted to sort of maybe have a more positive sort of final note on positive representation of humanitarianism. And I think what we are also seeing emerging is that there's a discussion, at least, on, I would call them maybe a bit more softer issues. When we talk about empathy, when we talk about dignity, when we talk about collaboration. So that also sort of decolonization doesn't just mean this is something that happened between traditional colonial nation and the colonies, but that it's also really about the mindset of how we usually northern, Western, neoliberally minded people define humanitarianism and what other forms, how we can also dismantle our, not just the positionality, but also the philosophy and the practices that come with this.
Fantastic. That amazing openings. I mean, I feel like we don't need to go on with the rest of the discussion, but we will. And building on the critical issue of the who, the what, the why, and how of representation, I want to ask you now about performance. Again, this is an issue that your work touches on in relation to who does aid work and who is considered an aid professional. Tobias, you have questioned and critically self-reflected on these performances in your own work on ethnography and international rituals. While Farhana, you have argued that decolonizing how we approach aid is necessary because the practice is dominated by Eurocentric thinking and practices that see former colonies as lacking or less than. Can I ask you both to reflect on what type of performances are seen as legitimate or legible within aid delivery and what these performances reflect? And perhaps I can ask Tobias to kick us off here.
Love to. I have sort of structured my response sort of along three different forms of performances. So, and I will start with sort of the performance of humanitarianism on the ground. And there was a very telling image the other day. The BBC was reporting on the cuts in the UK's aid budget. And the picture in the background was a plane dropping humanitarian supplies, which is, first of all, a tiny part of humanitarian action, but it's also fraught with many, many problems. So basically, every humanitarian will tell you airdrops are a bad idea and should really only be the last resort. But that's also part of the performance when news organizations or NGOs, organizations think about aid, there is this action component. Humanitarianism is a WFP truck delivering flour in Yemen. And of course, these are all important and valuable activities, but there is a performative element, and especially social media amplifies that a lot. But I also think, for me, performances from an academic point, there is sort of what I call the indoor performances. I mean, a lot of, when we talk humanitarianism, we see the conference halls, we see the hotels, we see Jeff Crisp does an excellent job on Twitter. He has a sort of, which organizations has the largest plastic banner in the background. So we also have a performances when humanitarian actors meet in Cox's Bazar, it has to look a certain way. We have a lineup of panelists, we have the exact same table, everybody has a plastic bottle of water in front of them. And that's also sort of part of the performance. We are doing something, we are meeting, we are discussing, we have a coordination meeting, and we have a nice lunch. And I think these performances probably deserve a bit more attention because they're very powerful, because they consume a lot of people's time. And when aid workers give you maybe a bit of a more snarky or ironic breakdown of their days, it will feature long meetings, specific meetings that have a structure, that have an agenda, that have a clear order, and who can speak. And I think that's a really important part of how humanitarian performances are perceived, because then it automatically means who isn't in this room, who can't access the nice 5-star hotel in the capital city. And the last level for me is the political performative level. The chair of the UK Charities Commission, she posted an open letter in the Mail on Sunday, last Sunday. And it was a very sort of apolitical statement, sort of a plea, please don't bring politics into charity. Charity has a certain way, we are helping people and we run a food bank, wonderful, but please don't bring, your pesky party politics, particular Labour, but don't bring your pesky party politics into our beautiful space of charity. And this kind of apolitical performance, that we can differentiate, there is something, charity, we give, its objective is neutral, we have a food bank, we feed hungry people. It's limited and it's not really connected to the real politics and the messiness of politics. So I think that performance is also very much alive. And I think those are the three levels at which I like to look and analyze humanitarian performances.
Thank you. Farhana, can you jump in here?
Sure. So I think the types of performances that are seen as legitimate or legible within aid industry or humanitarianism are still rather Eurocentric, as Tobias nicely detailed just now, in terms of thinking about who are the valid aid workers, planners, decision makers, conference goers, and so on. And we see that there is this kind of repetition of the same types of power brokers, and this therefore reinforces those issues of difference and disparity. So let me just speak a little bit more about how institutions and discourses kind of circulate to reinforce what we visibly see through imagery or at conferences, or how people talk about these issues. So what we're seeing is that, a lot of folks have talked about how aid or humanitarianism seems to follow these patterns of colonial hegemony and dominance, but we're seeing that also in the internal class structure in the personnel, where the higher ups who go to the conferences, who make decisions, who are budgetary, gurus, are often folks from the West or from the global North. They're usually foreigners in spaces that are in Latin America, Africa, Asia, whereas the national level or field level operatives in terms of personnel in various organizations are domestic nationals who hold much less power over decision making or in occupying leadership positions, having their voices heard or heeded, and often get to go to these conferences, show up in posters or images and so on. So all of that is also very performative, right? So what we're seeing is that there is increasingly some shift that's happening, but clearly not sufficiently, given the stories that Tobias just relayed to us. So what we need to therefore think about is how aid or humanitarianism should be practiced, and how those higher level decisions or positions and leadership roles are often situated in certain spaces among certain embodied peoples, and these are not equitable practices. And so when we think about these, the critiques of top-down planning and how these have been transforming, we still see what are considered legible performances remain those that reproduce those dominant or hegemonic practices, approaches, and matrices. And these are definitely dictated by elites and decision makers that are not often based in the countries in which the aid or humanitarianism or development is occurring. So I think this is where critical reflexivity becomes really necessary in order to start to think about how we can shift power relations and decision-making processes. One of the things that's really been coming up to the fore recently is that if we have been universalizing Eurocentrism as part of the colonial and imperial projects for about 500 years, and despite the ongoing discussions of decolonizing aid or decolonizing development or humanitarianism, there's still a long way to go to shift those ideologies, but then also decolonizing people's minds and practices and institutional structures in personnel hiring, in the circulation of imagery, in how decision-making is set up, and thinking through how do we therefore confront this creative adjustment of coloniality, which has been how humanitarianism and development has often been portrayed? And then what are the ongoing logics of domination and infantilization, or superiority and inferiority continuing? And so when we think about issues such as extraction of resources or restructuring of nation states or consolidation of power in the hands of few global elites and corporations, the ongoing practices of surveillance and conformities, and the alienations, we need to think about how performance is very much part of these processes that may not seem to be part of the same ecosystem, but they are. So I think, we need to therefore stop privileging whiteness and the taken for granted othering of the majority world and seeing them as lacking or less than. And one of the things that I think that's really important, and Tobias hinted at this a little bit in terms of thinking about empathy and dignity, is that we need to really start to think about how much those holding power are willing to give up power and to embrace radical solidarity. So what does it mean to respect the autonomy of other peoples, or practicing collaboration and solidarity, thinking about these asymmetries? And then we need to think, therefore, at the same time, of how global capitalism and imperialism and patriarchy and racism and other forms of structural and systemic violence are perpetuated, often with some sugarcoating. So I think ultimately we need to go back to those issues of pluralizing voices and paradigm shifts, but then also being quite courageous and confronting issues where we see these kind of depoliticization going on, or these feel-good factors being promoted without questioning the underlying problematic imbalances and power structures. So if we really think about decolonization as both an epistemic and a political process, we have to see this as simultaneously as an individual, a collective, an institutional and structural issue to confront. And this requires ongoing affirmative practice of decolonization. It is not an event, it is a journey, and it's a collective journey. You don't really arrive at it, so therefore it is continual struggle. So this requires that collectivizing and solidarity building, but also requires sitting with contradictions and disagreements and being uncomfortable and practicing humility and working with those pluralities and cosmologies and epistemologies, but then working through the various struggles. Otherwise, we're going to continue seeing the similar issues and tropes of the images, of the discourses, of the practices and the policies that perpetuate these issues of domination and control and harm.
Fantastic. Maybe we can continue with sort of this idea of pluralizing voices and radical solidarity. So Tobias, can I ask you to reflect on the role of communication or new communication platforms, technologies and techniques, and the potential of these for foregrounding overlooked voices in decolonizing humanitarianism? And Farhana, can I ask you to reflect on what you mean when you talk of critical hope and the pursuit of social justice praxis? So Tobias, maybe you want to go first and then Farhana follow up.
Absolutely, thanks. Have my weekly curated link review on ethnography, which I started many years ago. So we are now at number 386. And it isn't just sort of a hobby, but it is, as I've learned over time, curating really has forced me to look elsewhere around the internet, in my social media feeds, on blogs, and especially as an academic outside traditional academic publishing, journal articles, books, and so on. And I think that has been such a rewarding experiment, because it really helps me to identify where are the great African journalists reporting from Africa, but also where are the great Tanzanian journalists reporting from Tanzania. But it has also really sort of opened up my understanding when we talk about development and humanitarianism for a holistic approach that moves beyond giving aid, or there's a humanitarian disaster and we have a humanitarian response. I really like to look at fashion, at culture, at movies, at journalism, fantastic fiction and non-fiction books being published by African authors, which are now also available globally. So it's no longer just sort of a niche that stays on the continent. And I think this richness is really what helps me to identify where interesting developments are happening. I mean, you mentioned the solidarity, but it's really about the everyday humanitarianism that comes out of it, that it isn't just about, again, sort of the Western global northern machinery responding, but what are local people doing? How are they connecting? And I know resilience is a complicated discourse we can unpack in another lecture, but how do people respond? Like, what are localized responses? What tools are used, and what is the latest platform? And I really think that, I mean, if we wanted to have more of this, an investment in journalism and media development is really part of it. And I know colleagues now have a huge, or not huge, but they have a project on media development, because I think having those critical voices and having the resources and the financial resources for critical voices is really important. And independent journalism is under threat in many places. And I mean, that's also, I mean, for many journalists speaking out, whether you are covering the elections in Tanzania or now in Uganda, or obviously when you try to have a journalistic commentary from Ethiopia right now, it is really difficult, it is really dangerous. And global development and humanitarianism can really play a role in supporting more independent structures. And I think that's a really important way, but also really making sure that it's low tech, it's low key, it's embedded in local realities. And I know Al Jazeera, again, a complicated topic for discussion, but Al Jazeera does an excellent job, really sometimes having local journalists, local eyewitness phoning in, using Skype, low tech. And that, I think, is always a good combination, having local voices, authentic voices from the ground, and making sure that they have a space to critically share the information, and us being willing to let go and not just always take the New York Times and the BBC as the primary or exhaustive resources for news, but push further and make sure that we diversify our media consumption as well.
Thank you. Farhana.
All right, so to answer your question about, why these concepts of critical hope and social justice praxis that I've been talking about for a little bit in the past. So let me for the audience, let me first start by talking about what praxis is to me. So in case it's an unfamiliar term. So praxis, with an X, is practice informed by critical reflection. And it has this internal feedback mechanism, excuse me, whereby action and theories are linked so that, corrections and adjustments can be made. And there's a lot of talk about, where did this arise? A lot of people attribute it to Black feminist scholars. Others have found location in the work of Paulo Freire from Brazil, amongst others from different parts of the world. But basically, it's that recognition of the limitations and challenges involved, as well as improving accountability where your practice is, has this feedback mechanism. So being flexible and reflexive allows for more impactful engagement and research praxis that are equitable and respectful of various differences, of local issues, and various processes of marginalizations. So the critical positioning of oneself within legacies of colonialism, of Eurocentrism, geopolitical power relations, and various subjectivities mean that one's positionality is always being produced in relational ways, depending on the context. So if we want to be ethical to people who have been marginalized or silenced or othered or depicted in problematic ways, and to different places in the journey of decolonizing or decolonization, we need to therefore continually revisit power relations and rethink praxis and what that means. So linked to this is the concept of critical hope, which I think is really necessary to pursue social justice praxis as a method or as a way to think about decolonization. So critical hope is not the same thing as just having hope. It is not stubborn hope. It is because stubborn hope is just insufficient for continual struggle. So basically, this does come from philosopher Paulo Freire, where he argued that critical hope enables transformations because you're working through the struggle, right? It is not hope then action. It is action as a process to getting to hope. And therefore, critical hope is rooted in political struggle and social justice goals, and it is productive and generative, but it is not easy. It requires work, but it can be emancipatory. A hopeful stance engenders openness to different outcomes, and it is not naive in its expectations or just simply throwing up your hands and say, I have hope, and therefore things will be all fine and dandy. This is not about happy, happy, joy, joy. Critical hope enables a sense of purpose, and which requires you to work through challenges. So if we're thinking about decolonizing development, aid, or humanitarianism, I believe that we need to have a praxis of critical hope towards global social justice. And the conscientization that enables praxis and transformations to occur means that it has to be based on recognition that oppressed people can be active agents of change, that people who have been marginalized and sidelined are valuable, have humanity, and therefore it requires having meaningful dialogue and emphatic responses that are rooted in activism. And activism is a word that is not liked a lot in academia or in the aid world or in humanitarianism, but I don't think you can really have praxis unless you're really in tune with what's going on in the ground. You cannot theorize and operate right from the ivory tower or from far away. So when we think about critical hope praxis, we can think about how this can help understand and drive social change rather than result in hopelessness or learning about how a project failed post facto. It enables an ongoing envisioning of possibilities and mobilizations and collectivities. So when we think about critical global social justice praxis based on critical hope, we can think of it as a part of a process of decolonizing humanitarianism and global development, of delinking Eurocentrism and capitalist worldviews, of promoting new ways to articulate and promote notions of equity and futurity that gesture towards more direct engagement with issues of oppression, inequality, and subjugation. So we really do therefore need to think about how things are conceptualized and practiced, and therefore centralize local voices, practices, allyships, affirmations, and so on. And I think critical hope can sustain these processes of transformations because there's a continual feedback mechanism, because the process is difficult. No struggle worth a damn was ever easy. And I think, personally, I think that because when we talk about decolonization, because it is a continual and a collective process that can be frustrating, we need to practice and acquire skills that lets us practice critical hope to transform our praxis, where hope is fundamentally being about hopeful in the process or the journey of the struggle, so that we can address or confront these challenges and crises without being completely paralyzed with the sense of dread or overwhelm, but to have this profound ability to bring forth and hold on to critical hope through the processes and the challenges, so that we can start to envision and collectively build what global social justice can even mean.
Fantastic. So finally, before we open up the discussion to the Q&A, I want to move the conversation briefly to the notion of harm. And in both of your research, Farhana, here I'm thinking about your work on water, the climate and ecologies, and Tobias, your public advocacy and communication work on social media and the aidnography blog. And that there is in both of your work a focus on harm, whether it is the harm that aid work can do or the harm to other forms of life that is overlooked in a focus on the human. If we take humanitarian ethics and the do no harm principles seriously, how can a recalibration of what harm we see or consider work towards decolonization? So Farhana, if you'd like to briefly take that up before moving on to Tobias.
Sure. So for me, a recalibration of harm, or how harm is measured, as well as reducing any potential for harm, I think one of the foundational concerns that should guide our discussion on aid and humanitarianism is that there are increasing attention to different forms of harm. That, we are thinking about harm beyond physical or political to issues of ecological harm, especially in related to environmental governance, climate justice, water delivery project, forest conservation, and so on. However, this is often approached nature in a utilitarian way, which means how can we save the environment or species to help human societies advance, right? But increasingly, we're seeing an intrinsic valuation of nature in the do no harm when people are talking about rights of Mother Earth or rights of species to exist and so on. So beyond these concerns of harm in understanding human-environment relationships, there's also the underlying ongoing legacies of colonialism and epistemic harm, or what is called epistemicide. So this means the erasures of different types of knowledges or ways of knowing and being in the world, and the hegemony of various ideologies and epistemologies globally that erases indigenous and Southern epistemologies. And part of that is often very much more holistic in encompassing the human being as part of nature, rather than seeing as nature being separate from humans, which is quite Eurocentric in its ideology. So when we think about epistemic biases in global education and global policies and global politics, and what the implementation of those biases mean, we can start to see how different forms of harm are reproduced and re-entrenched and therefore normalized. So given the resistances and counter narratives have always existed, but were suppressed or ignored. So when we think about not doing harm in the process of decolonization, it basically means thinking about excavating what was silenced or suppressed. It's about deep humility and deep listening. It's about recognizing that lived experiences, the everyday embodied emotional lived lives of racialized and marginalized people need to be centered, rather than the centering of colonial logics, of Eurocentric values of separation of humans from nature, or the centering of whiteness in terms of who is the knower, who is the giver. Because harm needs to be accounted for in complex ways. Harm can be done through not just mobilization of monies, but also through what is taught, how people are conditioned to believe themselves, how people sitting in various countries around the world reading Shakespeare rather than their own scholars, not learning about their own ecosystem, but perhaps learning about an ecosystem elsewhere, not learning about the genocide of their own people, but learning about the Holocaust of certain European peoples. So those are various forms of harms that are done in normalizing what values and whose histories matter. So if we want to think about, to counter that, we need to simultaneously also recognize that we should not universalize local knowledge where we find it, because local knowledge is contextual, right? We cannot just take knowledge from one place and therefore say this partial truth or this situated knowledge can therefore be the one and only way to counter various forms of Eurocentric harms. So I think this means that recognizing that specificities and historicities are important to heed, and therefore decolonizing in one place may look different from another because context matters. So in order to be mindful of doing less harm, I think we need to therefore get past token lip service of diversity, of anti-racism, of inclusivity, and all the different communities or committees of diversity that are proliferating, because harm can also come up when these terms are co-opted in various neoliberal institutions, where it becomes a form of greenwashing or whitewashing or diversity washing, right? So then they become just hollow rhetorical devices or hollow gestures. So, I think in conclusion, thinking through these issues of not doing harm or the different forms of ways that harms can occur, in my mind, to think about radical or substantive solidarity and ethical engagement are ways to think about how do we do an anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-patriarchal decolonization process in a collaborative, collective way towards global social justice practice as a way to address different forms of harms, whether it's ecocide, epistemicide, and so on. So to think about certain ways we can do this is, think about issues of mutuality, shared responsibility, of care ethics, and research ethics and research practices that are more ethical and accountable. So we need to therefore think about those being centralizing logics rather than the logics of civilizing, saving, enforcing, extracting. So we need to think about radical alternatives that have been envisioned or maybe have been suppressed or erased, but then are also continually being re-envisioned. And then how can we think about enacting the substantive cross-border solidarities? Because there's no one single or universal way to do this. There's no one single harm or one single harm erasure, right? There's no blueprint because it is a collective struggle. It is frustrating. This is why you need critical hope. And there is no one single way to do this. But I think one of the first things we can do is to think about how people can decolonize their minds to foster explicitly anti-imperialistic and anti-discriminatory mindsets. And then we can think about how not to reproduce power hierarchies in our own lives, in our practices, in our teachings, in our relationships, in our ideologies, so that we can start to think about various socio-ecologies, socio-political systems as they exist, but then think about our relational privileges. That irrespective of who you are and where you are, we have various relational privileges and relational marginalizations that occur in various power grids and power hierarchies. So if we think about, building intersectional, international, ethical solidarities, we need to think about these, emancipatory transformations as being possible ways to think about planetary justice. So, I think to think about reducing potential for harm, we therefore need to think about these issues of seeing humanity in others, think of yourself in other people, and practice critical hope and humility and deep listening and critical self-reflexivity, mutuality, aid, and solidarity building.
Fantastic. Tobias, do you want to jump in on the question of harm and how we can recalibrate it?
I mean, I think in some ways, of course, you can, if you show an image of a celebrity visiting a refugee camp, you can, in a general way, think about, this does harm. But obviously, I don't think we are meaning this form of harm. And I think what I found interesting with your question is that I would really stress sort of the harm that is done outside the humanitarian sector. I mean, I know we talk about do no harm, but when I'm thinking about sort of colonial or neo-colonial problems, it's perhaps less the actual humanitarian work that is carried out by Médecins Sans Frontières running a hospital in Afghanistan, but it's carried out by the American military-industrial complex. Britain selling aid and providing training to Saudi's military that commits war crimes in Yemen, I think we have a different scale of harm than complaining that WFP posts a nice kind of video with their trucks and their planes. We shouldn't sort of, we shouldn't kind of lose focus and say WFP is in Yemen not because they want to have nice content for Instagram, but because they are there because of war crimes that are committed through very different means. Similar sort of with the drone strikes in Africa, which is also a very sort of neo-colonial way of how the American drones fly in and kill people in many African countries. Sometimes the bad guys, sometimes there are civilian casualties. So I think we have a lot to keep in mind that we don't point fingers at important issues that the humanitarian sector needs to address, but also keeping in mind that there are many issues that lie outside the sector. And I think, for example, what Farhana was saying in a broader way, we have very good discussions around safeguarding and, for example, mental well-being. And I think these are small issues on an individual level for individual aid workers or individual groups that are also an important part. That it's only a beginning, but the UN is under pressure that their peacekeeping soldiers will have to take on responsibility if they father a child, if they have consensual sex, if there's sexual violence committed by peacekeepers. All of these issues will also give those on the kind of receiving end, those who are often very vulnerable and in a post-conflict, post-war situation, and they can also help to sort of decolonize that broader idea of what the UN is doing. And also with mental well-being, I think that's another way, because we also know that as organizations increasingly start to diversify, bring more people of color into their organization, have a more diverse leadership, it can also quickly lead to exhaustion. You can't just appoint sort of, the one black woman and say, this will fix everything. And then everything that has to do with anti-racist work is shoved on one person. We know this in academia. I know this, for example, in Canadian academia, happens all the time with Indigenous scholars. So you hire an Indigenous scholar, and then basically all the work of diversifying, your Canadian university rests on the shoulder on very few. So how can we use those issues around mental well-being that they also empower and help? Yes, of course, we want more diverse leadership, absolutely. But also, how can we make sure that it still leads to equitable, healthy, sane, long-lasting change that individuals can manage? And I leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to some questions now.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions, and I'm actually going to group some of them because some of them actually overlap in some ways. But the first question, we have a question from Lewis Turner. Hi, Lewis. He says, thanks everyone for the great discussion. In many sectors, there is an increasing discussion about how the decolonization agenda is being co-opted and in the process hollowed out. Is the same thing happening in the humanitarian aid sector? And if so, in what ways? I'm going to throw it open. I don't know who wants to tackle that question.
I think Tobias mentioned it at the get-go, and he talked about.
He did.
Some of the issues, but Polly, you and I were talking about it, about the tweet about decolonizing the World Bank, right? It has been co-opted. It has become the new, catch-all term, and we're not entirely sure what it means. It often means nothing. It often means something. So I think the issue is that, yes, to answer this question, it is being co-opted and it is being hollowed out. It has become almost a, hollow performative gesture, as I was mentioning. And then, it has become really problematic in that kind of, whitewashing of, the whole diversity narrative, which was also co-opted over the last few years. So one of the things that I think is really problematic, at least in the humanitarian aid sector, is when we start talking about decolonization as a process instead of decolonization as an event that you arrive at that institution. People need to think about these issues of ideologies, framings, narratives, policies, discourses, personnel, and then how you know, people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are increasingly being asked to take on those kinds of burdens that, you know, Tobias rightly pointed out, that some of us are just placed on so many committees because we you know, match that tick box metrics that you needed somebody who was non-white. So therefore there is that overburdening on some people. So instead of hiring more people, there's just this tokenistic hire, and that one person is being asked to do all of this work without there being structural change internally. It often becomes something that is just done for show.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen sort of the first tweets and TORs popping up that use the word toolkit, and I think this is kind of when my alarm bells, you know, go off. You know, there's an anti-racist toolkit, there's a decolonial toolkit. It is, I mean, we have seen similar iterations. 20 years ago, it was participation, and then, you know, there was a matrix, or there was a way that all the organizations' proposals needed to be participatory. And then gender came in, and then you had to tick boxes, you know, is your program gender sensitive, or, you know, does it include women? Yes, no. Or, I mean, I know from my own sort of research on peace building, you know, do you have a conflict sensitive project? Yes, no. And I think, unfortunately, knowing history, we'll probably see something similar where people basically ask, you know, are you an anti-racist NGO? Yes, no. And I think that's really, you know, that's really the danger. And that is actually part of the decolonization, is how do we get beyond a handbook, papers, processes, and find new ways of sort of changing things radically. But we also know that the industry is slow.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think this actually moves nice, and I'm going to group two questions here. So we have a question from Killian Spangler on localization and the localization agenda, and how this may or may not play into the politics of decolonizing humanitarianism, especially, and who gets to define, you know, what the local is in this context. And then a question from Yazid Zada, and I'm sorry, I'm going to make your question a little bit shorter, who wants to ask about, you know, how do we shift power relations in the context of the aid and humanitarian industry, when most of the aid comes from the same former colonizers, and when most of the headquarters of organizations are, of course, located in the West, global North, minority world, whatever we want to call it.
I want to sneak in Robert Chambers. I think that's kind of, you know, there shouldn't be a day, you know, where you won't mention him. And one thing I think Robert did very early on and very well was to highlight always sort of, you know, the center periphery that goes beyond sort of northern southern relationships. And I think localization, again, is very complicated. But if localization just means, you know, basically, you know, you look at the passport and you say, okay, we work in Guatemala, so you should be a citizen from Guatemala and be in charge. That's an interesting and important first step, but it doesn't say how that relates to how this particular person is engaging with indigenous ideas, with Pan-American ideas. And I think it's tempting to reproduce a localized sort of class of people that in the end may look very similar to us in terms of global northern people. They may have a different passport, and they may have sort of, you know, obviously a different local connection with language, culture, and so on. But at the end of the day, are we reproducing an elite that is still tuned in with global discussions of movement, of traveling, of the language, of the discourses, of the handbooks and checklists? Or do we have a space where somebody says, okay, if we want to deliver you know, aid in African countries, we need to include more than one local language, or we need to look at more than one group or tribe or peoples in that country?
All right, so Tobias has addressed what I would have said about the local issue in terms of work of many development scholars from Chambers down from the 1980s, in terms of neither fetishizing the local nor ignoring the local, right? Because there can be the tyranny of the local. And then also thinking about like how local is some sort of counterbalance to the global without recognizing how ideologies and education, colonial mindsets have already conditioned the local to form certain roles or, uphold certain ideologies and epistemologies. And then there's obviously the elite structure within the local, whether that's class, race, or gender, or some intersectionality that's contextual. So I think one of the issues, if I understood the question correctly, is in terms of, how does localization play into this? And I think this is an important issue that, as I was mentioning earlier, that, localization is often that, the decision makers are foreign and the implementers are local. But then suddenly if you have decision makers that are local, are they really in tune with different groups of people? Are they, aware of indigenous issues, of marginalized issues, or are they elite and therefore divorced and separated from different local issues? Are you likely to get better information? Possibly, absolutely. But then at the same time, I think it's important to not therefore use just a broad brush stroke and say we have X number of locals, but at the same time to not have any locals at all. And then I think the other question about something about shifting power relations and headquarters.
Yeah,
I think
it's really about resources and headquarters and location.
So this is what I was mentioning earlier in terms of, the headquarters are in powerful places in, either imperial or colonial, but then also increasingly you're seeing, China's role in Africa or other regional hegemons within different regional contexts. So these kinds of inequitable power relations, I think we need to think about how they're embedded in this like grid work of power, but then also therefore they're not ever separated, right? There's an ecosystem of various power balances that play out through, in the military industrial complex, through trade laws or trade agreements, through various bilateral and multilateral discussions, through international conferences and dialogue, but then there's also, counterbalances in terms of thinking about, how does like Tobias was mentioning, journalism, how does that counter what's happened or is ongoing? How do student protests play a role in shifting discussions and conversations about curriculum? Because students today are going to be leaders tomorrow. So if we want to see a shift in the system, we need to think about shifting education and media and pop culture and all of those things. Otherwise, we're not going to see shifts in a generational timeline. It's going to get further delayed. And I think we need to think about those issues around where power lies and then how power flows and who is doing these kinds of acts, but then also not just the embodied speakers, but also the ideologies contained therein.
Fantastic. And I'm going to finish the final question I have. And it's a question that a lot of people have asked. And it's a question that I was also going to ask you to end on. And it is effectively, is it possible to decolonize humanitarianism? What becomes of it once it's been decolonized? This is a question I don't have an answer to. So I want to hear what you have to say. Who wants to
Tobias,
take that
feel
on?
free to jump in.
No, Tobias, what do you...
I'm cautiously optimistic, and I think that some of it is of course there is you can start from a very radical point and you can say, we just don't do aid and humanitarianism anymore, and I'm not entirely sure that this is really sort of the only or the best way to decolonize. I think actually I would almost argue the opposite. I think it is important to have well-funded humanitarian response. I mean, sometimes you have to be a bit careful with UN advocacy, but OCHA was, I think, releasing a new report basically saying they're expecting 2021 to be kind of the worst year for their humanitarian work. So at the end of the day, I mean, when we really talk about sort of more narrow humanitarian approaches, it will rely on funding and it will rely on people doing some traditional humanitarian work, ideally with, localized approaches with local experts involved, absolutely. But I also think that when we think about decolonization, aid can play a role and it can play a positive role as well. And I think it's also important that, you know, when we talk about the underlying issue, changing power imbalances, anti-racist work, and so on, it is important that those projects connect people in the global north and in the global south. I think it's also a bit naive to believe, you know, if we don't have aid, if we stop everything, if aid workers from the majority world are no longer in charge and travel as experts, it will also mean fewer people will actually learn about things on the ground. And I think that finding that compromise, being respectful, being, you know, showing solidarity, connecting with existing initiative, absolutely, but also making sure that that solidarity will involve people in the global north, ideally liberal, progressive forces. And that's also where aid and development stops, because there are so many other powerful actors in place. So, you know, if you go out, you know, and you vote for the Republicans in the US, there's very little that sort of the humanitarian or the aid world can do. So you also have a responsibility wherever you live, you know, to engage in that positive change that will hopefully then trickle down and influence positive change along kind of the global chain of connection.
Okay, so let me just bring in, instead of repeating what Tobias said, because we're out of time, but just add a couple of points. So I think if we want to think about decolonizing humanitarianism or global aid or, you know, the development industry, I think we really do need to start with education. And I know I've said this before, but I think if we don't think about, like, you know, practical points of, you know, action, yes, we can think about changing practices and the industry, which Tobias has already talked about, but I want to talk about a precursor, that who are we training? We're training various people to therefore work in humanitarianism in the aid sector and the development sector and so on, but then also in corporations that are heavily engaged in these various sectors, right? Whether it's in resource extraction or labor markets and so on. So I think we really need to start with a very specific set of ideologies that counter different forms of extractive capitalist, you know, white heteropatriarchal racist systems that we live in. So therefore that means educating ourselves and future generations on what it means to be an anti-racist, what it means to be an anti-colonialist, you know, what it means to be a feminist, what does it mean to be an anti-fascist, what does it mean to be an anti-capitalist. So once you start to understand the vocabulary and the different ways scholars have talked about these issues, you can have a little bit of hope to think about the points at which you may apply pressure, or points at which you can play a role, because otherwise you get caught up in the juggernaut of the dominant narratives and ideologies. You know, and some of it is good, some of it has done good, and some of it has maintained highly problematic power imbalances and, you know, processes of exploitation and dispossession. So if we want to change things as they're happening on the ground, we need to educate ourselves and change what is taught to future generations.
Well, on that note about education, which I think is so important considering, you know, we are all educators, I want to thank you so much for both of your contributions. Sadly, that is all we have time for today. I feel like we could have just talked about this for a week. But please join me in thanking Dr. Farhana Sultana and Dr. Tobias Denskus for their important interventions and for taking the time to join us today. I know Farhana has to run off to another talk at Yale or online at Yale in a few minutes. But I really encourage you, if you've been, I think many people seem to be very, judging by all the questions, very enthusiastic about this. So please, I ask you to seek out all of their work. And sadly, this is the last Decolonizing Europe seminar for this semester. But we will be back in 2021 and are already working on new events. So please sign up for the newsletter for more information, or follow us on Twitter at ACES4, that's ACES_4, ACES_FOR. But for now, thank you, goodbye, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.